They said a life in 1864 was worth what you could trade for it. But one child, bought for $3, ended up changing the course of American history. By the end of this story, you'll know who that child was. The story begins in the choking air of Richmond, Virginia, in the early spring of 1864. The war had turned the city into a restless furnace, streets crawling with ragged soldiers, widows selling their wedding bands for bread, and auction blocks splattered with the rain of another dark day. The sky was swollen with smoke from foundries hammering out bullets and bayonets, and yet beneath that storm of metal and misery, another kind of trade still thrived, the trade of human life. Inside one of the city's lesser-known auction houses on Carey Street, a dozen men in frayed coats and blood-stained boots huddled against the wind. The smell of sweat and whiskey mingled with candle wax and mold. It was late afternoon when the auctioneer raised his hand and barked the next number. Lot 47. Boy, about 8 years old, no family, no known birth record, answers to Thomas. His voice was loud, sharp, cutting through the murmurs. A thin child stepped forward from the holding pen, barefoot, knees scraped raw. His shirt hung in tatters, but it was his eyes that silenced the room. Not pleading, not vacant, but awake, aware, as if he were memorizing every face before him. The auctioneer lifted a ledger, flipping through yellowed pages damp with humidity. He scribbled something, glanced toward the front row where a man in a gray coat held up 3 fingers. $3, the man said. The room erupted in laughter, a price barely enough for a pair of boots, let alone a child. Even the auctioneer smirked, uncertain whether to take it seriously. But the man in the gray coat wasn't joking. He removed his glove, reached into his vest, and laid 3 silver dollars onto the wooden table with deliberate calm. The coins clinked softly, final as a bell toll. Sold, the auctioneer muttered, stamping the page. That ledger still exists today, brittle and brown, the ink feathered like veins. The line reads, Lot 47, boy, approx. 8 years, name, Thomas. Purchased for $3 by Mr. Allen Freeman. Historians later noted how strange it was. In 1864, the price for a child, even one too young for field labor, ranged from $60 to $100. The $3 figure made no economic sense. But what no one in that room knew was that Allen Freeman wasn't a planter or a trader. He was a government contractor who supplied livestock feed to the Confederate Army, and sometimes intelligence to whoever paid more. To him, the boy wasn't a servant. He was a tool, a vessel for something hidden. As Thomas was led away from the block, the sound of the city swelled. Cart wheels, horse hooves, and distant cannon fire rolling like thunder. Freeman's carriage waited by the curb, its wheels caked with red clay. He opened the door himself, gesturing the child inside. "You can read?" he asked without turning his head. Thomas hesitated, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir," the man smiled thinly. "Then you'll do." No one saw what happened in the days after, but neighbors later recalled the house at 2nd and Clay Street, Freeman's property, where lights burned late and riders came and went at odd hours. It wasn't unusual to see uniformed men slipping through the alley behind his stable. A letter found decades later, hidden behind a fireplace brick in that same house, offered the first clue to what Thomas had been brought there to do. The paper, dated February 1864, was written in a careful hand and sealed with crimson wax. "Deliver by trusted courier only. Ensure the boy memorizes route and markings. No written names beyond mine." The signature at the bottom was that of Colonel David Harper, a Union officer presumed dead 2 years earlier. The letter was addressed to Freeman. Scholars still argue what their arrangement was, but one thing was clear. Harper was alive and playing both sides of the war. And the courier mentioned the boy was Thomas. Somewhere between Richmond and the Union lines, the plan began to collapse. Eyewitnesses from a Union patrol reported a carriage found overturned near a burned farmhouse just east of Cold Harbor. The driver, Allen Freeman, was dead, shot once through the temple. The horse was gone, and there were small footprints leading away from the wreckage toward the woods. No adult tracks followed. A child had escaped alone into no man's land. It was early dawn. The fields were glazed with frost, the air thick with the iron tang of gunpowder. Every step Thomas took would have been surrounded by the smell of smoke and the echo of distant artillery. When he was finally found 3 days later by Union scouts, he was crouched beneath a wagon, clutching a torn canvas pouch against his chest. His lips were cracked, his eyes hollow. One of the soldiers, Lieutenant Abraham Keene, wrote in his field diary, "Found a boy, maybe 8 or 9, half-starved. When asked his name, he said, Thomas Freeman. Odd choice of surname, given his state. Speaks better than any slave I've met, reads too." It was Keene's curiosity that saved the boy's life. Instead of sending him back across the lines, standard procedure for runaway slaves, he brought him into camp. The men gave him water, a blanket, and hardtack biscuits that he ate without looking up. When Keene offered to wash his shirt, the boy shook his head violently, pressing his arms tight against his body as though guarding something invisible. Keene noted that even in sleep, Thomas kept one hand clutched over his chest. That night, rain fell in sheets, drumming against the tents. The sound must have mixed with the distant cries of wounded men and the heavy breathing of horses, the scent of wet soil and smoke thick in the air. Keene wrote another line before closing his diary. He's frightened of one man. Says he'll know him by the silver boots. That single phrase would haunt the regiment in the weeks that followed. No one in the Union ranks was known for wearing silver boots, and yet the child's fear was unshakable. When he saw any officer approaching, he'd flinch and whisper, "Not him." The captain dismissed it as delirium, but Keene began to suspect otherwise. During one inspection, as the boy helped to sort rations, Keene caught a glimpse of dark stitching beneath the boy's collar. Thick, coarse thread, unlike anything used in the camp. The child noticed his glance and froze. Keene said gently, "You don't have to hide, son." Thomas turned away, his voice barely audible over the rain. "He told me to keep it safe." What it was, no one yet knew. But that night, Keene would learn that the $3 child carried something far heavier than anyone imagined. Something worth killing for, and something that would soon set into motion a chain of deaths, disappearances, and sealed files that even a century later still whisper through the archives like ghosts. The camp where Thomas found himself was a strange place for a child, a borderland between life and death, order and chaos. It sat on the edge of the Chickahominy River, its banks choked with reeds and the smell of damp gunpowder. Canvas tents stretched in uneven rows, their edges blackened by smoke from cook fires that never quite went out. Horses groaned softly in the distance, and every gust of wind carried the metallic echo of hammers repairing rifles. Men moved like shadows through the fog, their blue coats torn, their boots coated with clay that stuck like guilt. In the midst of that gray wilderness, the boy became something of a rumor. He didn't speak much. When he did, it was with the calm precision of someone older. The soldiers called him the Reader. At night, when the fires dimmed and men passed whiskey tins to forget what morning might bring, the boy would sit by the embers and trace letters in the dirt. Sometimes he'd whisper words under his breath, scripture, maps, lines of orders. And the older men would stare in silence, uneasy at the sight of a child reciting what many of them could barely read. Keene noted in his diary that Thomas never once asked where he was or who the men around him were. He seemed to already know. One morning, as frost glazed the camp's barrels and tents, Keene was called to the command tent. The captain wanted to know where the boy had come from. "He's a runaway," Keene said, but the captain shook his head. "No, son, runaways don't read, and they sure as hell don't talk like they've been to Washington." He placed a folded piece of paper on the table, a message received from the adjutant's office. "If a colored child fitting the below description is found, deliver him to Colonel Harper's command immediately." The description matched Thomas exactly. Keene's blood turned to ice. Harper. The name meant little to the men there, but Keene remembered hearing whispers. A colonel believed killed at Antietam, whose death had never been verified. The captain crumpled the paper. "If Harper wants him, it means trouble. Keep the boy close. Don't let him out of camp until we know why." That night Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat up near the fire, his face ghostly in the flicker. Keene joined him, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "Who is Colonel Harper?" he asked softly. The boy stared into the flames. "He's the one with the silver boots," he said. The tone was flat, matter-of-fact, but Keene heard something behind it, the kind of fear that doesn't fade with time, only hides beneath the ribs. Keene asked what Harper wanted from him. Thomas hesitated, then touched the edge of his shirt, pressing it over his chest. "He said I had to carry the words, not read them. Just carry." Keene didn't push further. The boy's eyes were too tired, too knowing. He left him by the fire and went to write in his diary, unaware that by morning the secret sewn into that shirt would change everything. The fever came quickly. The nights had turned colder and rations were thin. Keene found Thomas trembling in his cot, sweat shining on his forehead, lips whispering nonsense. The surgeon declared it camp fever and told them to strip the boy to cool him down. When they unbuttoned his shirt, something clattered to the floor. A small silver pin shaped like a bird, its edges dulled with dried blood. Beneath the shirt, along the inner lining, was a second layer of fabric stitched with horsehair thread. The surgeon tugged at it, and a folded piece of paper slipped out. The ink was smeared, the edges burned. Across the top, a signature, David Harper. Keene took the letter to his tent, his hands shaking. It was written in a military cipher, but several words stood out clearly: Richmond, Crossing, and a list of names, each followed by a mark in the margin, X. These were not orders. They were a list of men, Union officers, with crosses beside them. Keene recognized one of the names, Captain Merritt, the quartermaster. He had died just days earlier under mysterious circumstances. A chill passed through him. This was no ordinary message. It was a record of betrayal. When Keene showed it to the captain, the reaction was immediate. "Burn it," the captain whispered. "If this is real, it'll kill us all." But Keene refused. He wanted proof, wanted to know why a child had been carrying it. They sent a messenger to headquarters for instructions. The response came the next day. "Do not disclose. Return the courier to Colonel Harper's command immediately." That was when Keene knew the letter was dangerous. The government didn't want it studied. They wanted it gone. He returned to Thomas, who was slowly recovering. "What's in the letter?" Keene asked. The boy looked down. "Names," he said quietly. "He told me not to read them at night. Said the lamps might call them." Keene didn't understand. "Call them?" The boy nodded. "He said names have a way of hearing when you speak them out loud." Keene wrote that phrase in his diary word for word. By the following week, rumors had reached the camp. Harper's unit had been ambushed, his camp burned to ashes. Every man inside was found dead, except for Harper himself, who was missing. The child's fear made sense now. Whoever Harper was, he was alive, and he was looking for something. Keene gathered a few trusted soldiers and decided to act. He packed a wagon with supplies and took Thomas north toward Union headquarters, using false travel papers. The route was perilous, full of patrols and scouts, and every mile felt heavier. They crossed into Maryland under a fog so thick it hid the stars. The boy sat in silence beside Keene, clutching the pouch that held the letter. Once near a broken bridge, they stopped to rest. Keene dozed off for only a few minutes. When he opened his eyes, the boy was standing by the riverbank, looking at his reflection in the black water. "You should sleep," Keene murmured. Thomas didn't move. "He told me the river remembers faces," he said quietly. "If you look long enough, it shows you who's coming." The next morning, they arrived at a small farmhouse where Union intelligence kept temporary quarters. Keene handed over the letter. The officer on duty read it once, his expression turning pale. Without a word, he sealed it in a new envelope marked "For Presidential Eyes Only." Then he turned to Keene. "Where is the boy now?" Keene looked around. The cot was empty. The window was open. Footprints led away into the fog. He was gone again. The sentries hadn't seen him leave. Only the faint echo of his small boots remained in the mud, leading toward the tree line. Keene ran after them, shouting his name, but there was no answer. Only the wind off the river and the sound of distant thunder. That night, back in camp, Keene stared at the empty cot and wrote his final entry for the day. He vanished like a name whispered into the dark. The boy they bought for $3 carried the weight of a war on his back, and someone somewhere wants that burden buried. The ink bled across the page from his shaking hand as a candle flickered beside him, smoke curling into the still air, carrying the scent of wax, gunpowder, and fear. When they found him again, it was by accident. The regiment had moved east toward the outskirts of Petersburg, where the ground was a black soup of rain and rot. The air smelled of copper and decay. The wounded screamed through the night as surgeons worked by lamplight, sawing through bone, pouring whiskey over open flesh. Amid that chaos, a sentry spotted a figure crouched near the supply wagons, small, barefoot, soaked to the bone. It was Thomas. He held a bundle of rags pressed to his chest. When they brought him inside, Keene recognized him instantly. "My God," he whispered. "How did you—" But the boy interrupted, voice hoarse and low. "He's coming. The one with the silver boots." The captain dismissed it as delirium. Keene didn't. He sat beside the boy, who clutched that same pouch like a dying heartbeat. The smell of gun oil filled the tent. Rain hissed against the canvas roof. Thomas's fingers were blistered, his nails blackened from dirt and ash. Keene offered him water. "Tell me where you've been." The boy looked up, eyes glazed. "I went back to the river," he murmured. "I had to hide the words." His gaze darted to the tent flap, then to the corner shadows, as if expecting someone to step out. Keene leaned closer. "Hide them where?" The boy shook his head. "Not here. He listens through metal." Later that night, Keene found the pouch beside the boy's cot. It was empty except for a small scrap of fabric, a torn corner of the letter. The writing was still visible, though blurred by water. It wasn't coordinates this time. It was a single phrase written in Harper's distinct hand. "Silver carries the name to its grave." Keene didn't know what it meant, but it sent a chill down his spine. That same night, scouts reported sightings of a man on horseback wearing light-colored boots, moving between abandoned farms. He had been seen questioning refugees, offering gold for information about a child. At dawn, the fog rolled in thick and white. The camp looked drowned in smoke. From somewhere in the distance came the faint crack of a rifle. A few men laughed it off. Snipers, they said. But Keene noticed the boy staring toward the tree line. "He's close," Thomas whispered. "He always fires once, just once." When Keene asked who, Thomas only said, "The one who owns the sound." Keene ordered extra guards posted around the tent, but by nightfall 2 sentries had vanished. No struggle, no footprints, only their rifles left behind in the mud, barrels still warm. It was then that Keene decided to examine the remaining piece of the letter more closely. Under lamplight, he noticed faint impressions, indentations from previous writing on the page. He shaded over them with charcoal until new words appeared. The names inside must never reach Washington. Burn or bury the courier. That was when Keene realized the horror. Harper hadn't sent the boy to deliver a message. He had sent him as the message. The real information was sewn into his clothing, into the very fabric of his existence. The letter was merely a lure, a way to mark anyone who read it. Keene confronted Thomas carefully, speaking in a whisper so the guards wouldn't hear. "What did he do to you?" he asked. The boy didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the silver pin lying on the table. the one shaped like a bird that had fallen from his shirt earlier. "That's his," Thomas said. "When he gives it, he says you belong to him." Keene touched the pin. It was cold, heavier than it looked, the metal engraved with symbols that resembled a map. He pocketed it, unsure why, just before the tent flap moved slightly from a gust that wasn't wind. By morning, one of the horses was gone. The guard claimed he'd heard nothing, though his lantern had gone out around midnight. A trail of hoof prints led away from camp into the swamp. Keene followed them as far as he could before the mud swallowed them. He returned to find Thomas sitting up, fully awake, staring at something invisible. "He's wearing them again," the boy said. Keene didn't need to ask what he meant. That evening, the regiment received an official dispatch. "Be advised, Colonel David Harper presumed alive. Wanted for desertion and conspiracy." It included a sketch, thin face, sharp jaw, eyes too calm. And there, unmistakable in the drawing, were the boots, pale, metallic, reflecting light like mirrors. The men whispered that he was a ghost, a traitor haunting both armies. But Keene knew better. Ghosts didn't send letters written in their own hand. Ghosts didn't kill for silence. The next night the rain stopped, but the silence felt heavier. Keene heard the sound first, a faint jingle of metal outside the tent, like spurs. He reached for his pistol and froze. The sound stopped. He waited, breath held, the lamplight trembling. Then a voice outside, calm and clear. "You've something that belongs to me." Keene pulled the flap aside, but there was nothing except the wind moving through the trees. The footprints in the mud glowed faintly under the moonlight, silver dust catching what little light there was. He turned back inside. The boy was gone, the cot empty. Only the pouch remained, folded neatly on the pillow. Inside, another letter. This, one new, written in the same hand but fresher, the ink not yet fully dry. "You failed the first test. The child knows too much. Do not seek him." Keene's pulse hammered in his throat. He ran outside again, shouting for his men, but the fog had swallowed everything. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighed, followed by a single gunshot. When daylight broke, they found no body, only a trail of small footprints leading toward the river. The mud bore marks of struggle, one set deep, heavy, the other light and frantic. At the end of the trail, near the water's edge, something gleamed in the reeds. It was one of the silver boots. Inside it, a scrap of cloth with a single drop of dried blood. Keene took it back to camp and locked it in his chest. In the weeks that followed, reports spread of a boy seen traveling with deserters, always barefoot, always silent. Some said he carried a letter wrapped in oilskin. Others swore he was a phantom. Keene tried to dismiss the tales, but each night he'd open his chest and look at that boot, wondering what bargain Harper had made and what price the child was paying. The war dragged on. The boy remained a mystery, his image flickering through rumor like a shadow that refused to settle. And though Keene never saw him again, he kept writing, convinced that the truth was still moving somewhere between the lines of those vanished letters, between the creases of one torn page and the whisper of a child's voice that said over and over, "He's coming." Oh. Weeks passed before another sign of him surfaced, and by then, the war had shifted south. Rumors traveled faster than orders. They said a barefoot boy had been seen along the old rail lines near Richmond, walking beside a man who spoke little and never removed his gloves. The man wore a gray coat without insignia and carried a silver-tipped cane that clicked against the stones with every step. To those who saw them, they looked like a father and son, though the boy never spoke and the man never looked at him. Some soldiers thought they were deserters. Others thought they were something else entirely. Keene couldn't shake the feeling that the child was still part of a larger game, a message still being carried, even if he no longer knew by whom. One night, a scout brought word of a burned farmhouse a few miles from camp. The structure was gone, only black beams and melted glass remained. Among the ashes, they'd found a charred envelope sealed with wax. Inside was a letter bearing the same handwriting Keene had memorized months ago. He cannot cross the river until the boy forgets the words. The phrase sent a chill through him. Every piece of this puzzle seemed to circle back to that river, that message, that ghost in silver boots. He began to wonder if the boy's role had been far darker than a courier's, if perhaps he had been made into something symbolic, a living cipher whose memory carried information no paper could safely hold. Keene's obsession deepened. He began questioning civilians, deserters, and even captured spies. Most laughed him off. A few turned pale at the mention of silver boots. One prisoner, a Confederate courier named Ellis, trembled when Keene whispered Harper's name. "Don't speak it," he said. "That man doesn't serve any flag anymore." When pressed, Ellis told him that Harper had been part of an internal circle, a division within the intelligence corps known only as the Registry. Their purpose was to record unspeakable transactions, names traded for lives, secrets for mercy. But somewhere along the line, Harper had broken from them. He'd taken something he wasn't meant to keep, a ledger, perhaps, or a list of names, and encoded it. If Ellis was to be believed, the code wasn't written in ink. It was whispered, memorized, buried in a child's mind like a seed. That revelation consumed Keene's nights. The ledger, the boy, the letter, it all pointed to something that was meant to die with the war, something too dangerous to exist in peace. He began writing reports to his superiors, but the responses came back brief and dismissive. Cease pursuit. Focus on current objectives. Still, he couldn't. He'd seen too much. The letter, the boots, the missing soldiers. It had become more than duty. It was a haunting. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the boy's face half lit by lamplight. The whisper echoing, "He listens through metal." In December, a storm swept through the valley, breaking the roads and isolating the regiments. It was during that isolation that Keene received an unexpected visitor, a woman in a tattered cloak, her hands stained with soot. She said she had something that belonged to him. From her pocket, she pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges brittle and blackened. "He told me to give you this," she said. "Said you'd understand." Keene unfolded it and froze. It was another fragment of Harper's writing, faint but legible. The ledger breathes. "When the river freezes, follow the light that doesn't burn." He asked where she found it. Her eyes darted toward the window. "By the old rail bridge. The boy dropped it when the man fell." That was all she said before she vanished into the snow. Keene left that night with a small team, tracing her path to the bridge. The river had swollen and frozen in sections, glittering under a pale moon. And there, half buried in ice, was a shape. When they broke it free, Keene saw the gray coat first, then the gloves still gripping that silver-tipped cane. The man's face was untouched by decay, preserved by the cold, the expression strangely calm, as though he had known this end. But the boy was nowhere. Only small footprints led away from the body, across the frozen river and into the forest. Keene ordered the area searched, but the snow erased everything by morning. In the man's coat pocket, they found another object, a piece of metal shaped like a bird, identical to the pin the boy had once carried. Etched inside the wings were the initials R.W., the same letters sewn into the lining of the pouch Thomas had once guarded. Keene didn't know if it was coincidence or design, but the realization made his hands tremble. That night, he sat alone by the fire, staring at the fragment and the pin side by side. The firelight made the metal glimmer like a living thing. He began to suspect that Harper's purpose wasn't merely to hide information, but to immortalize it. What if the ledger breathes wasn't a metaphor? What if the code was alive, carried forward through memory and bloodline? The boy might have been trained, conditioned, even altered to carry that legacy. Every command, every word he spoke could be part of a pattern, a linguistic cipher that no one could break without him. In early spring, the war neared its end. Richmond burned, soldiers deserted in droves, and the old world began to collapse. Keene's orders came to stand down. But before he could leave, a final letter arrived. No messenger, no seal, Just a folded paper slipped under his tent flap. The handwriting was unmistakable. You found the shell, but not the seed. The ledger breathes through the one who walks unseen. Do not follow. He rode out alone the next morning, ignoring every command. For 3 days he tracked rumors through the countryside. Villagers who swore they'd seen a child by the river, a barefoot boy who spoke to no one, who slept beside the water and vanished before dawn. On the 4th day, Keene found the river frozen again in patches, melting in others. Along the bank, pressed into the mud, were the same small footprints, perfectly formed. He followed them until they stopped at a cluster of stones. Beneath one, he found a folded strip of cloth. Written on it in Harper's unmistakable hand were 3 words: "The name remains." Keene didn't know what it meant. But when he looked up, the forest was utterly still. The only sound was the soft crack of the ice drifting downstream. He turned back toward his horse, and in that brief moment, he thought he saw a figure at the edge of the trees, a boy, barefoot, hair tangled, watching in silence. For a moment their eyes met. Then the boy stepped backward and was gone, swallowed by the woods as though the earth itself had claimed him. Keene stood there a long time, the wind lifting the edges of the note in his hand. Somewhere behind the veil of war, beyond the reach of any record or regiment, a message continued to move. It no longer belonged to Harper, nor to the army, nor even to the boy. It had become something self-sustaining, breathing through time, carried by memory, by myth, by those who sought truth in whispers. The reports came in fragments, like whispers scattered by the wind. A Union officer found dead in his tent near City Point. No sign of struggle, no note, just a single cut across the throat so clean it looked almost ceremonial. The body was identified as Colonel David Harper. His boots were missing, his hands folded neatly on his chest. A trail of dark footprints led out into the woods but vanished a few yards away. Soldiers said it was the work of deserters. Others said it was a message. The file was sealed within hours, the area cleared, and Harper's name was quietly removed from active service records. But a few men who'd seen the scene that morning never forgot it. The strange stillness, the smell of cold iron, the faint scent of candle wax despite the open air. Something deliberate had happened there, something that defied the chaos of war. Major Keene was among the first to reach the body. He stood over Harper's corpse, rain dripping from his coat, and felt that same unspoken dread that had haunted him since the day he found the letter in the boy's shirt. The cut was too precise for a soldier's blade. Harper's eyes were open, pupils dilated, mouth slightly parted as if caught in mid-sentence. When they turned him over, they found a small scrap of paper pressed beneath his collarbone, soaked and nearly illegible. Keene could only make out a few words before it dissolved in his fingers. "The river remembers." He ordered the tent sealed, and for the next hour, he searched through Harper's possessions. There were maps, coded dispatches, a broken compass, and one strange item, a child's toy, a carved wooden bird painted in fading blue. Keene had seen one just like it before, months ago, clutched in the trembling hands of a boy who could barely speak above a whisper. He remembered the way Thomas had held it to his chest the night they found him, as though it were the only thing keeping him alive. The sight of it here, beside Harper's blood-stained desk, made Keene's breath catch. It wasn't coincidence. It was connection. The death sent ripples through the ranks. Some soldiers said Harper had been found out, that his double dealings had finally caught up with him. Others insisted it was revenge, that the boy had returned to finish what the war had started. One soldier, a medic who'd been near the encampment that night, swore he saw a figure leaving Harper's tent hours before dawn, a small figure, barefoot, moving through fog. "Didn't look right," he said, voice trembling. "Didn't sound right either." The air went still, like everything was holding its breath. Keene dismissed the men, but not their words. That night he couldn't sleep. The wooden bird lay on his desk, its blue paint chipped and worn. He kept staring at it, tracing the tiny initials carved into its base, TF, the same initials later found on that stone in Baltimore decades afterward. At the time, though, Keene didn't know the child's full name. All he knew was that every step of this nightmare led back to the same ghost. A boy worth $3, carrying the kind of truth men killed to bury. At dawn, he returned to Harper's tent. The body had already been removed for transport, but the blood remained, dark, thick, coagulated into a near-perfect oval beneath where the colonel's head had rested. He crouched down and noticed something odd in the dirt just beyond the tent flap. Symbols, faint circular markings drawn with the tip of a knife or maybe a boot heel. They weren't random. To Keene, they looked like coordinates, half numbers, half sigils. He copied them down in his notebook, unsure if he was documenting a clue or descending further into madness. 2 days later, he brought his findings to a superior, Colonel Rutherford, who barely looked up from his paperwork. "The man's dead," Rutherford said flatly. "Treason dies with him. We've got bigger things to worry about than fairy tales about phantom children." Keene pushed harder, revealing the letter, the toy, the markings in the dirt. Rutherford sighed and finally looked up. "You want to know the truth? The boy's already gone. We turned him over to intelligence months ago. They said he was useful." The way he said that word, useful, made Keene's stomach twist. "Useful how?" he asked. Rutherford didn't answer. He only said, "Some messages don't need paper." Keene left the tent feeling like he was walking through fog. He began to realize the child hadn't vanished at all. He'd been taken, reshaped, maybe even weaponized. And Harper's death wasn't revenge, it was containment. The system was cleansing itself, erasing the witnesses, severing its own infected limb. Every path that led toward the truth was quietly buried under bureaucratic silence. The ledger, the boy, the traitor, they were all part of a single machinery of secrets grinding itself to dust. As the war drew to its end, Keene's sanity began to falter. He'd wake in the night certain he heard whispering outside his tent, a voice repeating fragments of that first letter. He listens through metal. He cannot cross the river until the boy forgets. Sometimes he'd see small footprints outside his door come morning, half frozen in the mud. The soldiers joked about ghosts. Keene stopped laughing altogether. He became convinced that Thomas wasn't gone, that the boy had outlived his captors, his masters, and the war itself, that he had learned how to disappear in plain sight. Months later, while escorting wounded men back north, Keene received word from a nurse stationed at a nearby field hospital. She claimed to have treated a child fitting the same description, barefoot, mute, eyes too calm for his age. The boy had arrived after dusk, guided by no one. His only possession was a small strip of parchment sewn into his sleeve. The nurse couldn't read it, but she remembered the look on his face when she asked his name.
"He just smiled," she said.
Then he whispered something I didn't understand. Sounded like a date. 1869. When Keene reached the hospital, the child was gone. No one had seen him leave. The parchment was missing too. He questioned the staff, the soldiers, even the nearby villagers, but no one could recall the boy's face clearly. Some said he had blue eyes. Others swore they were gray. A few claimed he didn't blink at all. By the time Keene returned to his camp, he realized he'd become part of the same mystery that had consumed Harper. The truth wasn't hiding in the past anymore. It was living, adapting, erasing itself as it went. He stopped writing reports. He burned his notes, his sketches, his transcriptions. The only thing he kept was the carved bird, now darkened from handling, its eyes worn smooth. He carried it with him long after the surrender, long after the headlines celebrated peace. Sometimes he'd hold it and feel the faintest warmth, as if the wood itself remembered something. And on certain nights, when the wind came from the south and the river froze in silence, he could swear he heard footsteps, small, measured, deliberate, walking somewhere just beyond. It was years before anyone dared to speak of it again. By 1901, the war had become memory, wrapped in speeches and marble. But memory has a way of leaking through the cracks of time. It was in that year that an old trunk surfaced at an estate sale outside of Richmond, its hinges rusted, its contents waterlogged and forgotten. Inside, among a bundle of torn uniforms and faded photographs, there was a leather-bound journal belonging to a woman named Clara Hensley, a nurse from the final months of the war. Most of what she wrote was routine, lists of rations, fevers, morphine counts, until the entries reached February of 1865. Then the handwriting changed. The lines trembled, the ink darker, more deliberate, and between the usual notes appeared a sentence that would unsettle historians for generations. The boy they bought for $3 saved Lincoln's army. At first, no one believed it. Scholars assumed it was metaphor, the kind of sentimentality that seeps into war journals decades later. But the details in Clara's account were too precise, too anchored in things only an insider could know. She described a night when a wounded child was brought into her field hospital near Petersburg. She didn't know his name, only that he spoke softly and refused food. He bore a small scar beneath his chin and had the steady, vacant calm of someone who had seen too much. His clothes were in tatters, but the stitching on his sleeve carried an insignia she didn't recognize, a half-bird, half-cross emblem embroidered in silver thread. When she asked the attending officer where the boy had come from, the man only said, "He shouldn't exist." Clara wrote that for 3 days, the boy remained silent. He refused to sleep on the cots and instead sat by the window, watching the trees sway as if waiting for something. Once she caught him tracing lines in the condensation on the glass, symbols that looked almost like maps, though the pattern was incomplete. When she asked what it meant, he looked at her with eyes that seemed older than the war itself and whispered, "They can't find the river." She noted that his voice was clear but flat, more statement than fear. On the 4th night, the camp was attacked. Cannon fire echoed from the valley, shaking the ground. Clara recalled rushing the wounded to the lower barracks. When she returned to check on the boy, he was gone. His cot was empty, but on the pillow lay something wrapped in cloth, a small piece of parchment sealed in crimson wax. The wax bore the same mark as the embroidery on his sleeve, a bird over a cross. She opened it against orders, driven by something she described as a pull stronger than reason. Inside, in Harper's distinctive hand, were the words, "The ledger breathes through him. When the fire comes, follow the silence." For years, no one could verify whether Clara's entry was truth or hallucination. The journal itself was dismissed as apocryphal by military historians until forensic analysts examined the ink. It was dated correctly to the 1860s. The parchment she described was found folded between the pages, its wax still faintly red. The words were faded but legible. Harper's name appeared nowhere, but the phrasing matched letters from his other correspondences archived in Washington. The connection was undeniable. What Clara couldn't have known was that her entry coincided with another curious event. Around that same time, a dispatch sent from General Grant's headquarters recorded a breach in the intelligence line. Confederate scouts had nearly discovered the location of critical Union artillery, until, according to the report, a timely and unexplained redirection saved the entire flank. The man who filed that report, Lieutenant Keene, noted one strange detail. An anonymous informant had delivered the warning in the form of coordinates scrawled on a strip of linen, wrapped around a wooden toy bird. Keene's name faded from records soon after. It wasn't until Clara's journal resurfaced that the pieces began to align. Historians realized the coordinates matched the ones Keene mentioned in his lost dispatch, and the handwriting resembled that found on a series of intelligence memos signed only with initials, TF, the same initials that later appeared on the gravestone in Baltimore. The implication was staggering. The boy who'd carried the message out of Harper's camp hadn't just been a victim or witness. He had become the message itself. The information encoded within him, the pattern he traced, the silence he carried, it had been the mechanism that turned a battle and possibly the war itself. Clara's later entries grew increasingly unsettled. She described recurring dreams of the boy standing by the window, the glass fogging as he drew those same looping lines again and again. In one dream, the river outside had frozen solid, and beneath the ice she saw faces. Soldiers, hundreds of them, looking up through the glass, their mouths moving in unison. When she woke, the sound of boots echoed in the hallway, though no one was there. She wrote, "He said the ledger breathes. But if that's true, then who keeps it alive?" The journal abruptly ended 3 weeks later. The final line, written in shaky script, read, "He asked me for my name, and when I told him, he smiled as if he already knew. After that, nothing." Clara vanished from all census records after 1866. Her hospital burned in a mysterious fire the same year, and the surviving staff refused to speak of what was lost. One attendant, interviewed decades later, said only, "There was a light that didn't burn." When the journal reached the hands of archivists in Washington, it was quietly filed away under unverified accounts, Civil War intelligence. But whispers persisted. Some said the federal seal used to close the archive bore the same bird cross emblem Clara had described. Others claimed the emblem predates the war entirely, part of a forgotten order of messengers who operated between armies, trading information not for money but for something more abstract. Absolution, perhaps. The boy, they believed, was their final instrument, an orphan molded to carry not one truth but many. By the turn of the century, the story had warped into folklore. Locals near Richmond spoke of a barefoot child seen by the river at night, his reflection clear though his body was half shadow. They said he left no footprints, only small impressions in the frost that vanished by dawn. Some swore that every few years after the first freeze, a folded note would appear on the banks, blank, save for a single wax seal of crimson. In 1901, when the journal was first displayed in a private museum, a visitor reportedly noticed something strange. Beneath the glass case, on the leather cover, faint marks appeared under the lamplight. Fingerprints, small and wet, as if someone had touched it moments before. The curator dismissed it as humidity, but that same night, the building's night guard logged an unusual sound on his patrol sheet. Footsteps. Child's pace. Stopped by the river exhibit. What remained undeniable was the precision of Clara's words and their echo in real military events. Every timeline aligned too neatly to be fiction. The ledger, whatever it was, had existed, and the boy had carried it, either in writing or in memory. Harper's treachery, Keene's obsession, the erased records, all pointed toward something larger. A deliberate cleansing of evidence that the Union's survival had hinged, in part, on an enslaved child whose name history could not afford to keep. By the time scholars revisited the story, the evidence was already fragmenting again, ink fading, witnesses dead, files reclassified. Yet the phrase that Clara wrote still lingered like an afterimage on the mind of anyone who read it. In 1929, the workers' clearing brush near a forgotten cemetery in Baltimore came across a small, weathered gravestone, almost buried under decades of earth and vines. The stone was no more than a foot tall, its edges eaten by moss, its lettering nearly erased by time. Yet when the sun hit it just right, faintly carved into the marble were two simple letters, TF, and beneath them 6 haunting words, bought for 3. Freed millions. No one knew who had placed it there or when. The nearby graves belonged to former soldiers, midwives, and dock workers, but none bore those initials. Local historians at first dismissed it as a symbolic memorial, perhaps an anonymous tribute to emancipation. But one archivist, a quiet man named Robert Lyle, couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen those initials before. Lyle worked in the Maryland State Archive, combing through forgotten war records and hospital ledgers. A few weeks after seeing the stone, he requested access to Civil War documents stored in a restricted basement room, a repository of half-burned files rescued from the War Department after a fire decades earlier. The air was thick with mildew, and the folders were so fragile that some crumbled at the touch. In one folder labeled Confidential, Richmond, 1864, Lyle found something that froze him. A smudged entry, written in a soldier's blocky hand, recovered a child from Confederate lines, believed to have carried message from Harper Camp. Name uncertain, Freeman, Friedman, boy was silent. Cost of recovery, $3. It was the first time in nearly 60 years that the name Thomas Freeman, or something close to it, had appeared in official records. The line between fact and myth began to blur. Lyle spent the next year chasing shadows through archives, cross-referencing hospital rosters, personal diaries, and burial logs. Again and again, he encountered fragments of the same ghost, a nameless child, a missing ledger, a story whispered among the nurses about a boy who carried secrets greater than his years. In a nurse's journal dated February 1865, he found the clearest mention yet. The entry, written in faded brown ink, read, "The boy who carried the letter was not older than 10. They said his name was Thomas. The officers argued over his fate, but the colonel's blood was not yet dry." The nurse's journal gave new context to an old rumor, the mysterious death of Colonel David Harper, the Union officer found dead in his quarters with his throat slit. Officially, his death had been ruled suicide, an end brought on by stress and mental decline. But there were inconsistencies: the angle of the wound, the missing boots, the blood trail leading out the tent and toward the woods. Witnesses claimed to have seen small footprints beside the stains before they vanished into the trees. If the boy had disappeared at the same moment, what did it mean? Had someone protected him, or had he avenged himself? By 1931, Lyle had gathered enough material to draft a short article for the Maryland Historical Review. He described the gravestone, the archival clues, and the possibility that TF was indeed Thomas Freeman, the enslaved boy sold for $3 who carried a letter that exposed a traitor in the Union ranks. The article was quietly published and just as quietly forgotten. Only a handful of readers saw it, but among them was a retired librarian named Ruth Gardner, who had once worked at the Library of Congress. Gardner sent Lyle a handwritten letter containing something remarkable, a photograph of a faded gravestone rubbing she'd made decades earlier in a cemetery near Richmond, Virginia. The inscription read, "Here lies an unknown boy, brave beyond measure, 1864. On the back of the rubbing, Gardner had written, "Local lore says he came from the north and vanished after the colonel's death. 2 graves, 2 cities, both bearing traces of the same lost soul." The trail was no longer just a historical curiosity. It had become a ghost story winding its way through the nation's memory. Each discovery seemed to suggest that someone, perhaps many someones, had known the truth long ago but had chosen silence. Freedom in America had always come at a cost, and not all the debts were recorded in ledgers or laws. Some were carved in secret on stones too small to notice. In the years that followed, researchers began piecing together how such a boy could have ended up in the Union camp to begin with. Plantation records from Virginia suggested that young Thomas had been sold not once but twice, first as a domestic servant, then as a field hand. The $3 sale may not have been for ownership at all, but for passage, a bribe to move him past Confederate checkpoints under the guise of property transfer. It was possible that someone, maybe his mother, maybe an abolitionist disguised as a traitor, had arranged it. The $3 could have been both his price and his salvation. One faded letter in the National Archives offered another fragment. Written by a Union scout named Elias Crane, it mentioned a colored child delivering word from within the enemy's circle. The child, Crane wrote, spoke little, though he seemed to understand all. His eyes carried a knowing I've not seen in men twice his age. Crane was killed weeks later at Petersburg, but the mention confirmed that Thomas wasn't a myth whispered by nurses. He was a witness, a carrier of secrets powerful enough to alter battles, and yet, as Lyle's research deepened, the mystery only grew. Why had Thomas's name been erased from formal recognition? Why did no commendation, no record of gratitude, exist in any military archive? One possible reason was chilling. The exposure of Colonel Harper's treason, if publicly tied to the word of an enslaved child, would have threatened the credibility of the Union command and the delicate political balance near the war's end. It would have been easier, far easier, to erase the boy entirely than to explain how a child had uncovered what generals had missed. The final puzzle piece emerged almost by accident. In 1933, Gardner's niece found a folded paper tucked between pages of an old psalm book that had belonged to her aunt. It was a note written in the same hand as the nurse's 1865 journal. They buried him in silence, but not in shame. "We could not mark the name then. We can now." The handwriting matched the inscription on the Baltimore gravestone, the same flowing script, the same faint hesitation in the F. Someone, perhaps that nurse or her descendants, had finally laid the boy to rest properly. Decades after the war ended, what haunted those who uncovered the truth wasn't just the injustice of erasure, it was the thought that the United States, in all its if this story stayed with you, if it made you pause and feel the weight of how history hides its truest heroes, then don't let this moment fade into the noise. Stories like that of Thomas Freeman, the forgotten child who carried a nation's secret on his back, are buried in silence until someone chooses to listen. That's what we do here. We unearth the names history tried to erase, and we give them back their voice. If you believe some stories deserve to be remembered, if you want to keep uncovering the forgotten, the tragic, and the quietly heroic, then subscribe right now. It's the simplest way to make sure these shadows are never lost again. And after you subscribe, tell me in the comments what you think happened to Thomas Freeman. Do you believe he vanished, or do you think someone helped him start a new life under a different name? Your theories, your thoughts, your emotions, they keep this story alive. Every comment, every like, every share gives another hidden soul a chance to be seen. So take a moment, subscribe, comment, and keep watching. Because somewhere out there, another secret waits under the dust of history. And together, we'll bring it back into the light.